Andrew Sandlin, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Well, thank you, David. It's a joy to spend some time with you.
Absolutely. There's a lot of things that I'd like to cover, but I'd first want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, what it is that you do. I know you're the president and founder of the Center for Cultural Leadership.
Yes. So that is correct. The Center for Cultural Leadership is now 25 years old. So we're celebrating our silver anniversary. It's kind of hard to believe. CCL is a nonprofit Christian educational foundation designed to influence Christians to think Christianly about all areas of life and culture and impact culture beginning right where they are. So it can have both a narrow focus and a broader focus. It is CCL, if I can maybe sort of juxtapose it here. On the negative side, it is opposed to the idea that Christianity can be limited to a few churchly things or perhaps our private vertical devotional life, but areas like music and architecture and education and dance and science and politics are permissibly non-religious or secular. We hold the reformational idea held by great thinkers in our tradition like Abraham Kuyper and the Dutch intellectual Herman Dooyeweer that Christianity is designed to influence all of life. This is very different from and must be distinguished from the false idea some people have that those of you that believe this are trying to sort of gain political power to impose your vision on people. That's not what it's about at all. It's about redeeming things by the preaching of the gospel and the application of God's word in all of life. So for that reason, we're very interested in culture. I mean, it's right there in the name, Center for Cultural Leadership. Culture is religion externalized, so it's not simply a private matter. How we do our art and how we use various products and what we think about automobiles. All of this sounds very mundane, but all of it's shaped by particular religious assumptions, religious worldview, to use that language. So that's kind of conceptually what CCL is all about. We do this through, all forms of platforms, writing and speaking, lecturing, preaching, teaching, books, articles, Substack, and all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the quick elevator answer to your great question, David.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you, because you are the president and founder, and you're right, the name culture is right there. There is this term that's been thrown around. It's been thrown around for a little bit and was famously used by the atheist thinker Richard Dawkins, this term cultural Christianity. And I'd love to get your take, your thoughts on this sort of large umbrella term that's being used to include thinkers that are not of the Christian origin, but have gravitated at least towards Christian elements.
I think what people like Dawkins and others who are certainly not Christians have recognized is that Christianity is not just a personal existential faith, but it has these social and cultural implications. And historically, they have tended, on balance, to be better rather than worse. Now, I'm the first to admit that under the guise of a name of Christianity, there have been certainly some bad things that have happened. I mean, the Spanish Inquisition and many professed Christians in the United States supported slavery, which is abominable, and so on. But those are not the only things to talk about. We think about Christianity and spawning modern science and the moral codes of Western culture. And in many sectors of Christianity, the strong emphasis upon the arts. And I mean, we only have to mention in music Johann Sebastian Bach. And of course, I could go on and on. So when we speak even of Christian culture, I mean, we're talking about Western civilization. Christianity wasn't, of course, the only impact in shaping Western civilization. Certainly the Greco-Roman world was too, but it's kind of a synthesis of those. such that we can't speak about Western culture or Western civilization apart from Christianity. And most historians understand that. So people like Dawkins recognize that, and some of them are acknowledging, even if we're not personally Christians and can't buy the idea of trusting in Christ and the Bible as God's word, nonetheless, embracing Christianity as a cultural phenomenon, and that's kind of what they mean by cultural Christianity, is beneficial. So it's kind of, there's an oddity about it, David. It's even knowledgeable atheists might prefer to live in a Christian society rather than an atheistic society, if you'll think about it. In a Christian society, which is not perfect, but nonetheless, an atheist's rights would be respected. His or her property would be respected. There would be certain basic rights of free speech and religious freedom and free press and all these things that we tend to take for granted in our American and before that British system that couldn't be necessarily justified on pure atheistic basis. Of course, on the basis of atheism, like, well, let's say historic communism and Marxism, your rights can be taken away. The state gets to dictate fundamentally what rights are. Whereas in a Christian way of thinking, the state always has to be under God and his moral law and authority. So it's for that reason that a lot of these folks, that though not Christian, have recognized the benefits of cultural Christianity, and I tend to agree with that. I'll add quickly that, on the other hand, there are some sincere Christians that oppose this. They'll say, no, we can't have cultural Christianity. That's taking away from this very zealous, genuine Christianity, and all these cultural Christians are making it harder to win people to Christ. I don't buy that. I think we do need, of course, the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the only hope for individual salvation. But it's precisely this gospel that can reshape a society larger than simply individual belief, vital though it is. So that's kind of cultural Christianity, and I am a supporter of it.
Hmm. Well, hanging on this point for a minute, there's a wave of new thinkers who have not identified as Christian but fall under this cultural Christian umbrella. Jordan Peterson is a famous example, where he will take religious terminology and incorporate that into his lectures. Some have accused this as religious appropriation or Christian appropriation, how this is a misunderstanding, a misuse of trying to ground the theological in the, let's say, merely material. What are your thoughts on that interpretation?
Yeah, I think what's often misunderstood in that is that um, religion of some kind is inescapable. Our relationship to God is, or the term religion from Latin religio means to bind to the god or the gods. I mean, there is, of course, ancient polytheism, and then, of course, there's pantheism. All of us are committed to a higher power or higher powers. So religion is inescapable. What Peterson and others have recognized is that this sort of very clear contribution of Christianity to the modern, and for that matter, much of the pre-modern world. So for him, what is criticized as appropriation is really simply a recognition that Christianity has bequeathed all of these benefits to society. So for him, it's not so much importing a particular metaphysics to sort of justify his ethics. It's simply that it's very hard to justify ethics, certainly in the Western context, without an appeal to Christianity, overt or covert in some way. So I don't think in Peterson's case, and he would not acknowledge that there's something sort of furtive and sneaky going on. It's that it's hard to argue for the kind of ethics that he's arguing for, completely cutting oneself off from Christianity. I don't deny some people try that, but it's a difficult task.
Hmm. Uh, Backing out from this for a moment and taking a broader look at the very least, the nation of America. And this is a broad question, so feel free to take this in whichever direction you feel best. What would you say is the general state of Christianity right now here in the United States?
Well, boy, that's a great question. It's a mixed bag. I would say it's slightly better today than it was 15 or even 5 years ago. I think one indication of that is how that the conversion to Christianity on the part of very prominent popular people is becoming much more acceptable than it was a couple of decades ago. Very prominent people are acknowledging not just as Peterson Christianity, but are actually aggressively converting to it. One aspect of culture is, of course, professional athletics, which there are a lot of problems there, but a lot of professional teams, baseball, basketball, football, NBA, NFL, MLB, and all that. A lot of players and teams are very bold in expressing their faith in Christ. There also is a recognition of God's moral law and the fact that there has to be an ethical basis for society. The U.S. founders, of course, used this language of self-evident rights. They're God-given rights. The founders, certainly not all Christians, a number of them were not. Nonetheless, their thinking was shaped by a basic Protestant worldview, even those that were quite heavily committed to Enlightenment, like Jefferson and Franklin, for example. Nonetheless, none of them would repudiate the ethical basis of the Protestant heritage, no matter how much they disagreed with certain aspects of the historic Protestant creed. I think there is a recovery that you have to have this kind of Christianity to have a country, like the United States, to preserve the virtuous society we have and freedoms. On the other hand, we have had, of course, generations of sort of a secular humanistic approach. It's manifested itself in the last few decades with the Frankfurt School and sort of a cultural Marxism and the notion of what one scholar called the oppression-liberation nexus. That is that everywhere we turn, there's sort of an oppression paradigm going on. Whether it's, of course, men versus women, or whites versus blacks and other racial minorities, or the rich versus poor. Every human interaction can be reduced to some oppressiveness, a systemic oppressiveness. Now, as thoughtful Christians and as a cultural theologian, I don't deny at all that we have a history. I mean, I mentioned earlier the horrors of slavery, so I'm not denying that happens. But there's a very reductionistic approach by some of these people that we must see through everything in society through this lens. And that, of course, is a mistake. So in some of the elite areas of society, the influential areas, a lot of mainstream media and a lot of politics, whether both parties, though, of course, they're obviously different. Most of the major universities clearly are committed to this leftist paradigm. I don't want to imply that this can be reduced to politics. So that's perhaps not the best term to use. It's a religious distinction, because obviously there are self-professed conservatives and Republicans that have severe problems too. But it's more of the Christian worldview approach versus the non-Christian worldview approach. That's the best way to put it. So there is this conflict in society, and people say, why is there so much chaos today and so much argument? And of course, with the election of Trump, all the things going on, there's just all of this just radical conflict all the time. Beneath all of that, it's essentially a religious conflict. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. What we're seeing worked out in all of the sort of the cultural acrimony and all of the flame throwing that's going on X and other places. All of that is essentially a religious conflict, Christianity and biblical faith versus its alternatives. So having said all that, it is a mixed bag, and that's what we're in the middle of right now as we speak.
I want to come back to a few of the points that you just laid out, but one of the criticisms that's been levied at, let's say, you mentioned the more famous converts. One of them would be Russell Brand is a famous one. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, probably the most unexpected of all. And the criticism that's levied at these people is that it's not that they love Christianity. It's that they are reacting against something that they don't like. So one critic criticized this rise of cultural Christianity as being a sort of right-wing reaction to the crimes of the left. The reason someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali converted was because she hates Islam. She's scared of what is happening in China. She doesn't like communism. What are the things that go against this? Well, the West, Christianity, capitalism. This is why we're seeing a return to, or at least a perceived return to, Christianity. What would be your response to that criticism?
Yeah, I would not say that those accusations are entirely baseless. There have always been people historically who have converted for similar reasons. Obviously, not the identical ones to what you mentioned, but nonetheless, conversions on the basis of people, observing things in a society or a culture that they oppose, or perhaps even that really frighten them, and say, "Well, what is the best alternative, and what's the bulwark that I could put up in my own life against this?" And they convert to Christianity. I'm not prepared to say whether that conversion is authentic or inauthentic. For some people, it might simply be the adoption of cultural Christianity. But my particular view is that even cultural Christianity is better than its alternative, cultural anti-Christianity. So, but among those, and this is certainly among zealous Christians that I respect, they would say, well, these aren't real Christians. You see, they don't care about Christ's atonement, his bloodshedding, his resurrection, all these core historic ideas of the gospel of Christ. There's nothing in their nomenclature, nothing in their autobiography that indicates that they have an interest in that. It's sort of the cultural dimensions of Christianity. And I won't argue with that in many cases. I can't, of course, inspect the hearts of those who convert. But I do think long term that a conversion, even a merely formal, or we would say like notional conversion to Christianity, is better than none, because there are cultural and social benefits to Christianity, period. You mentioned Islam, for example. Christian societies Christianity produces different societies than Islamic societies. And though, of course, I don't have any brief or support for Islam as a faith, I would be the first to acknowledge certain favorable aspects of Islamic society, but there are a lot of unfavorable ones too. And Christianity tends to be the favorable alternative to these societies. There's very little in genuine Islamic societies historically and today, and I mean sincere ones. There can't be religious and political liberty. That's just the nature of Islam. Well, we do tend to have that in Christianity, and that's just one thing. So I understand why some of these people would convert without claiming that all of these conversions, or even most of them, are genuine. So I think we have to separate. Let's use this language, David. Notional or cultural Christianity, as opposed to existential Christianity. Existential meaning it's a part of my genuine existence. I've embraced the true Christian faith, the gospel of Christ, and so on. We have to separate this in our mind. Now, ideally, they should work together. I mean, I hope to say that I am an existential Christian and also a cultural Christian, but they're not identical.
On the topic of politics, this is something I've been wanting to ask someone, and I think you're the perfect candidate for this. So recently, the White House has been playing with some alternative government ideas. Trump put out a tweet that said, quoting Napoleon, "A man who saves his nation violates no law." There was the image of him wearing a crown. And while obviously some people are reacting to this negatively, there is enough of a voice that I think it's worth mentioning of people who kind of like the idea of shifting the government up a little bit. I had written a Substack post called "A Case for Aristocracy," which some people like, some people did. But I noted that John Adams in his private letters was actually very much pro aristocracy, as was Thomas Jefferson, even though they disagreed on how that aristocracy came about. Alexander Hamilton, famously, while he was anti-monarchy, made the proposition, I think it was in a 1787 speech, not that the United States have a monarchy, but they have a lifelong president with the powers of a king. And there, I don't see much of a difference between the two forms of government. What do you think about this, let's say, sudden interest, or maybe it's been bubbling for a while, but let's say sudden interest in exploring alternative government ideas other than democracy?
Yes. Well, I mean, first thing to recognize, and you're right about in quoting the founders, I don't believe there's a single occurrence of the term democracy in the founding documents or in the Federalist Papers rather, that's favorable. By democracy, of course, the founders meant what we would say pure democracy, which is what a lot of the French Revolution later and a lot of the Marxists would say. We don't have representative institutions, just quote the people, this amorphous, the people kind of decide the will. In the end, this means that there will always be sort of a body, generally an unelected body in the end, that kind of does the will, quote, of the people, however they interpret that. So the aversion to that kind of democracy, to the extent that we have it, have it today, is a good thing. I do believe strongly in representative government because I believe that actually is a part of the Reformation heritage. Thus, I'm a supporter of, and have edited books on this, and CCL's got a book on this very topic of classical liberalism. I don't mean modern interventionist liberalism, but the basic political philosophy of the founders, which was kind of rooted in Protestantism and some views of the Enlightenment, to be fair, which is essentially individual liberty. And that governments, in the Jeffersonian language of the Declaration, why are governments instituted? They're instituted to protect these God-given rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and property. And then he goes on to say, if government changes that focus and no longer does that, it's the right of the people to alter and abolish it. Quite a revolutionary thing to say, right? But that is a radical switch from almost all governments and states historically, according to which you were sort of born into a particular kind of society and you were shaped according to that kind of society. You shaped yourself according to the government. Whereas to the American founders kind of turned that on its head. They said the government is here to protect your God-given liberties. And I think that's basically an aspect of the Christian worldview as it relates to politics. Now, I do think, having said that, I'm not entirely happy at all with a lot of what's happening today, because it's not so much about representative government as it is about populism, which I don't support any more than I do democracy, certainly pure democracy. If Trump meant by that statement, as I think he probably did, I'm not sure, that whoever defends a country is kind of above the law. That's false. I mean, the aspect, one thing that makes classical liberalism and Protestant political theory, which I support, what makes it what it is that we have a government of laws and not of men, that politicians are subject to the law. And this is why politicians themselves can't just cast aside the law, can't cast aside the Constitution, but are bound to it. This is similar, of course, to the Christian notion that all of us are bound to God's word. By the founders' idea of aristocracy, which virtually all of them, even the most democratic of them, Jefferson, would have assumed. I mean, he believed in Virginia aristocracy for sure. I do tend to support that. Now, what it would look like today is obviously different from what it would look like in the early 1770s. But nonetheless, there should be a group of people, the best among us, that at least is related to politics, that we elect a political office to represent us. So we have this buffer between the people and the highest leaders. How do the people express their will? Well, yeah, they all vote, but it's not pure democracy. We vote on people who vote for us. And there's just great checks and balances with all that. So that's kind of a long answer, Dave, to saying, yeah, I think a recovery of that kind of aristocracy is fine, but I don't support the modern populism that seems to be increasingly rampant today.
Now, would you say we do have populism? Because I love this idea of the people elect the best among them to be the representative of, in this case, their state. And then those people go on and they represent the interests of the people. But what it seems happens more and more is this form of populism. Oh, I like this guy because, oh, he speaks really well. Oh, I like this guy because he has really nice hair. That was an actual quote from somebody as to why they voted for a candidate. I like this person because he says the things that nobody else will say. This is a classic populist line. How does that factor into aristocracy and then more broadly this sort of government we have right now, where it seems that there are not everybody, but a large amount of people who were elected because they were popular, not because they were necessarily the best?
Yeah, that's no other way to put it than to say it's bad. I think the reason, of course, populism has been around. It was certainly been around in the U.S. since Andrew Jackson, first great populist president. He's been around before then. I think that the kind of populism today that we have, and you kind of hinted at this in your question, is a sort of a celebrity populism. We do live in a celebrity culture. People are their brand. I mean, let's think of President Trump, rightly or wrongly. I mean, it's not just the president is effective at what he does. We agree with his views or not or whatever. I mean, he is a brand. There's the Trump brand. He's got it on the side of his plane. He even has Trump steaks and Trump ties and all that. That's not a specific criticism of him. That's true all over the culture. And of course, the problem with that is it tends to sort of move to the background, or perhaps even eliminate the two qualities that the founders would have thought are necessary to have the right kind of society, and that is virtue and liberty. They believed in a virtuous, free society, and so you want to elect people that are themselves inherently virtuous and support freedom, and that's what all of the founders believed. And when they spoke of virtue, of course, it wasn't obviously Islamic virtue and certainly not secular virtue. It was basic Christian virtue, even among those, as I said, that were not specifically existentially Christian. That, of course, is not a principal concern today. It's like you said, well, I like that politician's hair. Some people, even Donald Trump, I like the way he speaks. I like the fact that he's just kind of rough and he owns the libs, and I like his language and sort of things. I like that's really that's dangerous and does not bode well for a society. The founders all understood, the U.S. founders all understood that the political structure they put into place with all of its checks and balances can exist only when you have a virtuous population. And they said that. They said, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, there is no system of government that can survive if you have non-virtuous people. I mean, we've seen that historically. When the population itself, a large number of that population turns to vice. This happened, of course, in the fall of the Roman Empire, and a number of empires historically. It doesn't matter if you have a heavenly form of government. It's not going to work. And part of that's what we're seeing. I think one thing that I support and CCL supports is a restoration of an understanding of this American form of government and the checks and balances. it has been remarkably resilient, David, historically. I mean, we've had some very difficult times. I mean, we've been riven by a horrific civil war, and then, though somewhat less so, nonetheless, traumatic two world wars in the 20th century, and presidential assassinations, and as I joke to my friends, we've even survived disco music. The American society, in its political dimension, has been able to resist these things and recover, because the founders established a very good system of government. Can it last forever if the population itself isn't virtuous? No, but I'm pretty bearish on the United States, so I'm pretty optimistic about the immediate and certainly the future down the road, 50, 100 years.
Mm. What can be done to rectify this virtue problem? In the past, there have been situations where governments have either been overthrown or the government changed radically in order to try and control the population. And both situations don't seem to work out great.
No, no, they don't. You're exactly right. Well, I'm glad you asked that, because as a Christian, excuse me, I think that fundamentally virtue is possible only on the basis of the gospel of Jesus Christ and biblical faith. And we've talked about the Christian influence in the U.S. founding, and the founders recognized this. Several of them even said, apart from religion. And as a quote I have in one of the recent books we put out on this very topic, David, I think it was called, the very title of the book is Virtuous Liberty. I quote John Quincy Adams, in which he said, I think not too long after the revolution itself, he gave a speech in which he said, this country was founded on Christian principles, and if we ever, abandon those principles, we can't expect for the country to survive. So this is where I would like to bring up the importance of virtuous institutions like the family, and by that, of course, I mean the intact traditional family, and of course the Church of Jesus Christ as the guardian of the gospel and of biblical truth. If you don't have these things, that they are the ones that supply the virtue to society. It's not the responsibility, by the way, of the state to impose virtue. Now, state protects these institutions so that they can practice, and in the case of the church, preach and cultivate virtue. But we have a name for governments and political systems that attempt to impose virtue. They're called dictatorships. I mean, that's exactly what the French Revolution did. They had the revolutionary religion, secular revolutionary religion, imposing a secular religion. Marxism, notorious for imposing virtue. Of course, their virtue is not our virtue. The virtue of a common property and the desire to own things for oneself and one's family is some evil, inherently evil. And so we're going to have the virtuous society, which is to say the society of common ownership. Now, that's a false virtue, but nonetheless, it is a virtue that they attempted to impose. So we actually want to get the government out of the virtue imposing business and into the business of protecting citizens. And that's exactly what the founders wanted. It wanted to protect. It is a system for protecting liberty, protecting citizens from one another, protecting citizens from, of course, foreign invasion, and then finally protecting citizens from a rapacious state. One of them said, famously, our goal is to basically protect citizens from one another and then arrange a state so that the state can't inflict tyranny on the population. And that's what their form of government did. But apart from the gospel of Jesus Christ and biblical faith, long term, you really can't have that virtuous society. I mean, let's think about it. Why, where we do even have a residue of a virtuous society, Northern Europe and United States and England and so on. Well, those are all societies that to one degree or another were influenced by a sector of Christianity or more than one sector. And by the way, that's also true in the East. Russia, old Christian Russia, far from perfect. Tsarist Russia, far from perfect. But nonetheless, it was an intact society, and it was, of course, overthrown radically in the 1917, and when all of the murders and rape and pillage produced, and the same is true in communist China and so on. So, I mean, Christianity produces a particular kind of society. We may not like it, but that's the way it's happened historically. Secularism and Marxism produces a particular kind of society. Islam produces a particular kind of society. Hinduism produces a particular kind of society. So we have to be able to look at all of these and assess them and compare and contrast them. And in my view, Christianity comes out overall looking pretty good without, in any sense, being perfect or without blemish.
There are people who will say these things that I've seen this a lot on X. There's a attitude of suspicion towards, let's say, the intellectual. There's an anti-intellectual crowd, which I know you've spoken on before. What is this resistance to, I don't want to say the experts, because that's a little bit of a loaded term right now, but let's say the intellectuals?
Yeah, that is a big problem. That, too, as you probably know, David, that tends to be historically an almost infallible mark of populism. These intellectuals and these experts and these elite folks have basically told us what to do, and we're tired of it. Let's throw them out on their keister. And we don't need to trust experts anymore. We have an internet. Well, of course, there are several main problems with this. The first, I would say, and I too am very suspicious of certain elites, but elitism is an inescapable concept. I mean, all of the founders were elites. I assure you, not one of the founders was a pitchfork populist. All of them were well educated. All of them were thoughtful. All of them were intelligent. All of them are what we would today call, although some of them would not have called themselves this, they're what we would today, looking back, call intellectuals. Virtually all of them. So whatever we say, we're always going to have an elite of some kind. Of course, there's a business elite, there's a vocational elite. You were talking, of course, about an intellectual elite. You can't really have a good society, without an intellectual elite. My problem is not with the elite, and my problem is not with an intellectual elite. My problem is with the kind of intellectual elite that have been governing society, in Western society, for the last, few generations. Particularly in the universities, it's largely been a secular elite, and because of that, their view is also, they're what Thomas Sowell, himself an intellectual, conservative intellectual, called surrogate decision makers. In other words, their view is that, well, we can't trust these little peons out there to make decisions, so we're going to make decisions for them. McDonald's hamburgers are bad, so we're going to make them illegal. Of course, I'm obviously stretching the truth, but there is this idea, and even the RFK Jr., there are hints of that with him, is there not? Of all this bad food, so we need to penalize people that eat this food that's bad for them. I'm certainly not saying that all food's good for you, but should elites be telling you what to eat? No, they should not be, and that's just one example. This suspicion of intellect and intellectuals is actually dangerous, and people are never consistent on that point, David. So we don't want intellectuals in the cabinet. We don't want intellectuals in the presidency or in government. We just want the good old common folk to do it. But I assure you that if those people develop a brain tumor, they wouldn't go and say, I'm going to go to a guy that learned on the internet about how to operate on my brain, and I think I'll just pay him $1,000. He can probably do as well as this surgeon that gets, several $1,000,000 a year. No, they would never say that. They would say, I want the most qualified, in general, a very well-educated, perhaps even the most educated person I can get, the most intellectually and vocationally competent person I can get. So that, of course, is the problem. And I must say, I love social media. I love digital. We're using digital technology right now. Where would we be without it? But I think that social media has not always helped us here. because there is the idea, well, I mean, I don't need to listen to an intellectual. Anything an intellectual can say, I can find on the internet. That's actually missing a vital point, and that is that intellectuals, certainly the right kind, it's not just the knowledge they have, it's the kind of intellectual virtues they have to give them the wisdom to be able to communicate that knowledge and to deal with problems in a particular way. So just accumulating knowledge is not the same thing as being an intellectual. An intellectual is somebody that is able not just to accumulate knowledge, but to synthesize this knowledge and to weigh this knowledge and to think about things and to discuss them with others and come to certain, at least tentatively sound conclusions. That's part of what it means to be an intellectual. And populists don't understand that, thinking if they can just get knowledge from the web, that'll be enough. But it's not enough. So part of what CCL is all about, we call ourselves somewhat jokingly, and this is not an original expression, David, but the adversarial intelligentsia. That is, we're not adversarial to intellectuals, but we are adversaries of the anti-Christian intellectuals that have brought, in my view, great harm to society. So it's never a case of intellectuals versus no intellectuals. It's a case of which intellectuals, and we want to be the right kind.
Who are some of these anti-Christian intellectuals?
Yeah, well, I mean, we could go
And I
through the
apologize. It's a
list.
leading question because I've read your I've read your work on this, so I'm obviously leading somewhere. But I'm curious to get your thoughts again on this.
Well, yeah. So on the cultural front, one is a professor at Cal Berkeley, and I can say this: I have two children that graduated from Cal, two very conservative, sociopolitically conservative children that graduated from Cal. I mean, Judith Butler, who was, I mean, back in I guess it was the 80s, maybe even earlier, was writing things sort of supporting the strongly pro-trans agenda that is getting a lot of pushback in the last 3 or 4 years, which is a good thing. I mean, Judith Butler certainly would be an example of one of these intellectuals. Before I come back to today, I think I mentioned earlier I'm laying some historical background here. The Frankfurt School, so-called Frankfurt School from Frankfurt, Germany, these cultural Marxists, like some of your listeners may have heard of, Max Horkheimer and Herbert Marcuse, and people like that created. They did not create secular thinking, but they created a particular Marxist way of thinking that was adapted to Western culture and was different from Russian communism and Chinese politically revolutionary communism, but sort of a culturally revolutionary way of thinking. In the presidency, there's no question that one of our recent leftist presidents that was an intellectual was Barack Obama. Though I disagree with him strongly on a number of points, there's no question that he was well educated, leftist intellectual. So, I mean, we could go down the line in various fields. You mentioned, of course, before Richard Dawkins, who has changed a lot, of course. And we had probably 10 or 15 years ago a number of these, what we jokingly call the village atheists, intellectuals, wrote a lot. Sam Harris, I think.
Sam Harris.
Don't hear about him much lately. A number of intellectuals like that. And of course, maybe I'm dating myself, but I mean, Isaac Asimov and in those who write in science fields and so on, and on down the line. So there are a number of these people who they have an outsized influence because they do think, and they think a great deal, and they think hard, and they can come up with actually very plausible, from their standpoint, certainly, and the standpoint of many reasonable people, plausible solutions. And that's why, though they're in the minority, their influence is greatly disproportionate to their number. Intellectuals will always be a minority, even a vast minority in society, and yet their influence, of course, will be much greater than their number. And that's as it should be. It's just that we need the right kind of intellectuals. I would go so far as to say that though he's known as a businessman, George Soros is certainly an intellectual. He thinks about some of these issues. The people at the head of the major foundations are certainly, almost all of them are intellectuals, certainly the educational foundations. So these are the kinds of people who we need. We need Christians who have an equal commitment to intellect and who are equally well educated, who are able to speak the truth and to go toe to toe with these intellectuals in society. Because, as I often like to say, it takes worldviews to defeat other worldviews. Many Christians seem to think that if they simply go to church on Sunday and hear a nice, good 3-point sermon, topped off with a dollop of a very pleasant, sentimental poem, and go home and listen to some Christian music on K-Love, that's really going to cut it. But it's not. Only Christian only worldviews can defeat other worldviews. That's Marxism understood that. Marxism is a worldview, and it understood that Western society was based on a worldview, and so they'd attack that worldview. So that's kind of a long answer to your question, but that's why we need intellectuals, and that's also why secular and non-Christian intellectuals are so dangerous, because of their outsized influence.
One of in the list I had seen from your Substack, and it was a very well written Substack post, by the way. And for anybody listening, they should go and read it, because I've enjoyed going through and looking at the things that you've written. You write much more than me, which I need to catch up. I have a long road ahead to
Oh,
even
I'm
get
sure
halfway.
you will one day, my friend. Yeah.
In the list, and some of them I wasn't surprised by, like a Heidegger or a Nietzsche, and Nietzsche especially because he had famously labeled Christianity as a slave morality. So that makes sense as to why that would be considered an anti-Christian thinker. But
yes.
I was surprised to see Plato on the list. Why is, in your view, Plato an anti-Christian thinker?
Well, that's a good question, because a lot of Christians have attempted to synthesize the Platonic thought with Christianity, more so with Aristotle, but they certainly have Plato. He certainly influenced, directly or indirectly, many of the church fathers.
Thomas Aquinas was a Neoplatonist.
Yes, for sure. And if anything, Aristotelian. But Plato was the real problem. Well, there are several problems, but I called him anti-Christian because one of his basic ideas is, well, let me mention two of them quickly. Virtue without revelation. Biblically, according to the Christian worldview, virtue comes to us because we're made in the image of God, but we understand virtue as a result of God's revelation, his revelation in nature, and his revelation, of course, in his written word. That wasn't the case, of course, for Plato. It didn't come through revelation. It came through what he called the ideas of the ideals. That's a cornerstone of Plato's thought, that he tended to have a rather low view of the physical world. And everything we have in the physical world basically has its counterpart in the true world.
The theory of forms.
Yes, the forms. We would say a famous one used as, for every actual chair that's created in this world, there is in the ideal world, chairness. And of course, the goal down in the physical world is to conform everything in the physical world that we can more closely to what it is in the ideal world. Well, today it's odd, but Platonism is not a prominent idea in modern philosophy at all. In fact, modern philosophy is aggressively anti-Platonic. They put it in the rearview mirrors long ago, but it does have an impact in the Christian world, and it's understandable, David, why it does, and that is Plato at least acknowledged that there is something beyond the material. Of course, modern secularism is largely, if not exclusively, materialistic. Humanity is nothing more than body and blood and bone and electrical impulses. And Christians say, no, 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 that's not how cynical that is. And as that's what, of course, and Nietzsche and modern secularists hold, how terrible that is. There's no hope. Everything, when you're dead, you're just dead. What a terrible way to live. So at least what we get from Plato is that there is a real world beyond this world. And I agree. That's to that extent, he's correct, but that's not the biblical answer. I think the danger with Plato, with respect to Christians, comes from the opposite direction. With many of them, they move away from the importance of this world, and for them, the only thing that really is important is heaven. And so they think about that the gospel is a message of, well, trust Jesus so you can go to heaven when you die. And they live this life to go to heaven. Whereas, frankly, in the Bible, the message of the gospel is the good news of salvation, in which God, through Christ, will eventually restore this created order. So if we're very Platonic in our thinking, we'll tend to have a very low view of creation, as Plato did. Of course, he wouldn't consider it creation anyway. He believed in the eternal forms and so on. But Christians that tend to be Platonic will tend to sort of push creation to the background. That's a mistake. It's because secularists, David, have put they wouldn't call it creation, but the material world in the foreground, saying the creation is all there is. What did Carl Sagan famously say? The material world, the universe, or the cosmos is all there was, is, and ever will be. Well, that's just a deeply pessimistic life philosophy, and he understood that. Christians, understandably, react to that, but they go to the opposite extreme and say, well, I'm just going to live for the afterlife. But that's equally false. And that's why I think Platonic ideas that have influenced Christians can be and have been very dangerous.
There's two objections that jump into my mind. I'm going to try and articulate it, and I want to hear your response to this. The first one, and this might just be semantic, and if it is, feel free to dismiss it. Plato being around before the time of Christianity. I know that some people have said there's a chance he might have read the Old Testament, and maybe this influenced some of his thoughts. But other than that, there's no... I guess the objection would be something like, how could Plato be anti-Christian if he didn't know what Christianity was? How could he be anti-something that he doesn't even know exists? The other one, and this is on the theory of forms, and you can take this in whichever order you want, I'm reminded of two scenes in C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. The first is the silver chair with the character of Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved that name because he was such a bad kid. There's a scene in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader where the narrator asks Eustace to identify a star. What is a star? And Eustace says, oh, well, it's a ball of gas. And the narrator responds, my boy, even in your world, that's not what a star is, only what it's made of. And then in the last battle, when all of the main characters finally arrive in Aslan's world, they realize that the Narnia they knew was just a reflection of what was the ideal form of Narnia that they could never access because they existed in a fallen world. None of these ideas seem to mesh well, or perhaps dovetail well, with Plato's theory of forms, and don't seem to counter anything Christianity says, but merely gives a different angle of understanding it. So you can take that in whichever order you want, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on both.
Good questions. On the first one, I think you're correct. Plato certainly was not formally and explicitly anti-Christian because he was pre-Christian. I probably should have done a better job. And when I say anti-Christian, I would say anti-Christian worldview. His views tend not to be in harmony with the Christian worldview. But on the second point on Lewis, I mean, Lewis was definitely Platonic, and I don't want to deny that it's possible to adapt certain aspects of Plato to the Christian worldview. It's been done. Lewis did it, and a number of people historically have. I would suggest my view on how to address these issues on what is possible in this particular material world is possible because of another world. And in this other world, of course, Plato, it would be the world of the forms. I would simply call that, in the biblical worldview, is the creational world. We read in the Genesis 1 that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens are not eternal. The heavens are a created reality. God sort of eternally was not living in heaven. God doesn't need a place to live at all. Heaven was created for God to relate to man and to the rest of creation. So there's no question that in the Hebrews and elsewhere, even speaking of the creation of the building of the the temple, that there were certain earthly patterns. So I'm very willing to acknowledge that good things on earth are based on patterns that we see in heaven. I would not like to identify them too closely with Platonic forms, simply because they often tend to, well, for one thing, they tend to constantly turn our attention away from the created material order. And in my view, biblically, the point is to interpret this material order in terms of God, the heavenly revelation, and the God who is the creator. This created order, the Bible is the OS. The Bible is the operating system of this created order. And so therefore there is in other words, what I'm suggesting, the bottom line here, I should say, is the unity between the heavens and the earth, the unity between the heavens and the created order. Whereas with Plato, you tend to see much less of a unity. There's generally a very strong division between these two. And that's why we're constantly trying to turn our attention away from this material order. No, the important thing is not the material order. It'll bring us down, lead us astray. And a part of this, even when he talks about virtue, let's just take one thing. The passions and emotions for Plato tended to be very substandard and tended to be negative. For him, the contemplative life, the philosophical life, the virtuous life is a life that tends to keep emotions deeply in check. And the higher we go into the ideal world, we tend to be less emotional. But see, there's nothing biblical about that at all. In the Bible, the emotions are neither inherently good nor bad. They should be good. God is an emotional being, properly interpreted and understood. So those are sort of my objections to the Platonizing of Christianity. But I don't deny that people like Lewis were able to make good use of Platonic ideas to reinforce what, in his case, was mostly a Christian worldview.
The last question I always ask everybody, because criticism is easy and conservatives are very well known for it. And this is a great question actually to ask a cultural leader. What is a positive vision that you, in this case you, Andrew, have for the future?
Oh,
I should say a positive vision that you would like to manifest for the future.
yes. Different Christians have different eschatological views, that is, views of the future. And this is not only sort of the eschatological views of eternity, the consummate age, but also the pre-consummate era. In other words, what's going to happen on earth? I interpret the Bible in a way that's often called postmillennial. In some ways, that's not the best term because it's kind of rooted only in one's interpretation of Revelation 20, and that's kind of reductionistic. Basically, it's the idea that as a result of Christ's atoning death and resurrection and the preaching of the gospel and the application of faith in society, that over time there will be a gradual success and gradual Christianization of society. Some people would use the older term revival or reformation, but I'm thoroughly committed to that. The book of Isaiah says one day that the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. Beautiful metaphor. And the nations themselves will come into Jerusalem. Of course, he said to the Jews, but I think that's a kind of good universalized language today. That is to say that the nations themselves would, on the whole, bow the knee to King Jesus, that there would be the great shalom, the great peace. Why do we have conflict in this world, David? We ask ourselves, why do we have conflict? Everybody on every side, whether secular, non-secular, Hindu, Islam, says no one would say, oh, we live in a peaceful world. All of us recognize it. Well, what's the source of that? The Christian answer is sin. And what is the gospel designed to do? It's designed to mitigate and eventually, in the consummate world and eternity, eradicate sin. So the positive vision is the success of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But I would suggest, and this is the important thing I think behind your question, that success is not only an existential success, a vertical success, my vertical relationship to God, or horizontal only to the extent that it impacts my family or my horizontal relationships at church, but it affects all of society. So to just tell you quickly, I believe that in the future, this what we call today cinema will be greatly influenced by Christianity. Incidentally, I don't mean by that all movies are explicitly Christian movies, that all movies have to tell the gospel. I mean, it's like Philippians 4 would tell us there, whatever is beautiful, whatever is true. And whenever they depict sin, and sin must be depicted, and depicted as very evil, it's depicted in an accurate way. And this is true of all other areas. I mean, some people, Christians that don't have any appreciation for culture, they kind of wince when I bring up architecture and dance and art and so on. But all of these are cultural phenomena that our cultural betters have always understood. This is true of poetry, and of course, as you would understand because of your field in music, classical and otherwise, the influence of Christianity in classical music has been wonderful. Only Christianity? By no means. Mozart wasn't a Christian, and many others were not, but nonetheless, there's a big influence. And there's also an element here, and I must mention this. I didn't think of it till now, but part of the Reformation worldview includes common grace. That is, that God is gracious on unbelievers and also believers. So we speak of God's special grace, the grace of salvation in Christ, but God's grace, his favor, is often shown to unbelievers. And that's why you can have those that are non-Christian that nonetheless can come up with remarkable notions and can contribute remarkably to society. I mean, I'm no physicist, but I can understand the basics of Einsteinian physics, and it's just extraordinary what he was able to come up with. Well, God was able to give Einstein a remarkable intellect to deal with these things. And it's true not only in science, but in the arts and in education, music, literature. And I believe that over time, the positive vision through the gospel and through God's common grace, in other words, through God's grace, whether special or common, that it's going to, grace will increase over time. Grace will increase over time. So I look forward to a glorious future. I want to say this, though. I'm not suggesting that before the Lord returns, there's going to be like such a golden age, there's no sin, and that there is some sort of utopia on earth. That will not happen. Sin will only be abolished when Christ himself returns and establishes the eternal state. But nonetheless, I believe that sin can largely be mitigated. So that's my positive vision for the future, based in grace, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and in God's common grace.
Andrew Sandlin, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, David. It's been a delight.